Hello, my little seventh graders. This is your second video about the Cold War. Just to go through some small things very briefly. Again, your essay due Friday by the end of the day at 4 p.m. If you're in my class, I don't know if Miss Jordan's going to do that, but that's what I'm doing. We read about the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union is really running the show here in terms of the Cold War. Again, the idea of the Cold War was not an actual war, but because of the relationship between the United States and other Soviet and communist controlled nations, it was a cold relationship. The idea between spreading communism and capitalism in Europe. We looked at the concept of containment, again, preventing communism from spreading, which was unsuccessful. The United States and the Soviet Union conducting atomic bomb tests, which eventually became an arms race and an Iron Curtain, meaning a Berlin Wall that separated Western Germany, the free side, from Eastern Germany, the communist side. We then looked at the Berlin Airlift, sending over $13 billion worth of goods to communist nations to get them to side with, well, the United States and Europe. We also looked at the Rosenberg trial, the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who in America were thought to be Russian spies. They were violating espionage. Espionage and sedition. Espionage means spying on your own people and sharing those methods with other people. So there was the thought that the Rosenbergs were sharing atomic bomb messages, which we're not sure of, but they were executed, which showed just how crazy that the Americans were about communism. If you share information with the Soviets or other communist nations, you can be executed. We then read about the U-2 incident, where an American spy plane flew over Russia, and then he was shot down by the Soviets, and the pilot was then put on trial, and he was in prison for 10 years. So the United States was furious that he was caught, but at the same time, well, the United States was spying on the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union and the United States then agreed, fine, we are not going to spy on each other like that. And even though the United States was spying on the Soviet Union, they said that they were not. Well, they got caught in the lie. And so now both sides were physically acting on each other's decisions by flying over each other with the threat of dropping bombs. And so now it becomes an arms race. The idea that, okay, the Soviets now, in 1949, the USSR, the Soviet Union, detonated a nuclear weapon, and it was 500 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. So now the world is seeing an arms race, a massive building of bombs and missiles by both the United States and the Soviet Union between 49 and 91. And let's be realistic. If that were to have happened, well, all of these nuclear weapons could have ended mankind altogether. So we've got this political cartoon of John F. Kennedy arm wrestling with Nikita Khrushchev, both sitting on atomic weapons with his finger close to the button. It got so bizarre and so weird. I remember you watched the duck and cover video. Apparently your desks are atomic bomb proof from what I read on the internet. And so now the idea of like, okay, we're going to build nuclear fallout shelters and kids are going to duck under their desks and cover and we're going to be ready for the atomic bomb. You're not. It was a way to calm the nerves of Americans that don't worry, we can prevent complete destruction of the nuclear weapon. No, you couldn't. Even the government was going to say, hey, we are going to ensure that we're ready for the atomic bomb if we need to be. You're not. You can't be ready for the atomic bomb. That's just not going to be the case. But the United States even put out things like, what is communism? And these articles were published. And it was a way to get Americans to think communists were evil people. And movies were even made. I mean, James Bond movies made Soviets enemies. Rocky IV made Ivan Drago look like an enemy. So it was crazy. The Cold War moved to Asia. Remember, we read about China, so we don't need to get into too many details. But in 1949, communism spread to China. And the United States' containment policy was clearly not working as Mao Zedong formed the People's Republic of China, which was modeled off the Soviet Union, a Chinese communist government. That then spread to Korea. The idea that Korea might fall to communism. And so Northern Korea, which was once controlled by Japan, eventually fell to communism. And so now we're seeing that the United States is trying to help Southern Korea become free, where at the 38th parallel, which is latitude, the 38th degree latitude, that this is going to be the line that divides North Korea and South Korea. So now communism has been contained only in South Korea. In North Korea, which sided with the communists, they eventually fell to communism. Again, communism was not being contained. So communism is being spread by the Soviet Union into China and North Korea, which is showing Americans that containment is not working. And every single one of these countries that falls to communism, the United States is not going to negotiate or trade or work with them. So the Korean War, which if you haven't watched it, watch it. It was unpopular. Americans were pretty much wondering, why do we need to go to these areas? 3.5 million Koreans were killed or wounded. 54,000 Americans were killed. And a lot of Americans began to wonder, why are we going to these countries? Why are we, the United States, trying to fight communism over there? Shouldn't we just try to prevent communism from coming here? And also, this is a big deal because the United States pretty much lost the Korean War. It was a stalemate. And in that sense, a stalemate pretty much meant that the United States didn't win. So now you're seeing a war fought in a different country, and the United States did not come out the winners. So the United States' ability of containing communism is not working. Eventually, the Cold War reaches Cuba. So Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan, man, they were the ones who watched communism spread. They're the ones who saw communism go from just Russia to other countries in Europe, to then the building of a Berlin Wall, to then now we're seeing an arms race, and now communism is spread to Korea, now it's spread to Vietnam. Communism is now going to Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the government in Cuba and created a dictatorship. And remember, when people grow desperate, they will turn to any type of government control. And that's what happened here in Cuba. Castro immediately created an alliance with the Soviet Union. And because of that, the United States feared, oh man, communism is now only 90 miles away from the United States, because Cuba is not that far. On April 17, 1961, the United States tried to invade Cuba in an area called the Bay of Pigs. And when the idea was they were going to invade Cuba, kill Fidel Castro, and overthrow a communist government. It failed. The United States was unsuccessful. And what happened was the United States then realized, dang, our attempt to overthrow Castro was a lot harder than we thought. And America's military wasn't looking as strong as people thought it was before. There was also a satellite that showed, oh man, there's missile equipment in Cuba. And this missile equipment is, again, only 60 miles away, 90 miles away. So Cuba could effectively launch a nuclear weapon that could hit cities like Atlanta, Chicago, Washington, New York, Denver, Mexico, LA. And so it freaked the United States out. In October 1962, President Kennedy even said to the Soviet Union, you better not give them any more nuclear weapons, and these nuclear weapons better not be detonated. And so it was a tense standoff. There was a 13-day standoff called the Cuban Missile Crisis where either nation could possibly go to war. The United States asked the Soviets to remove these weapons, and for 13 days, Americans wondered, are the Cubans going to send a nuclear weapon? Heck, it got so bad that a hotline telephone was installed between Cuba and the Soviet Union. The United States and the Soviet Union. So, again, the idea that Fidel Castro could launch nuclear weapons and they could affect all this area, it freaked the world and the United States out. This Cold War was leading to now another enemy, Cuba. The Cold War then, tensions finally slowed down and there was no nuclear attack. But again, for 13 days, the United States was terrified that a nuclear war could happen in the United States. The Vietnam War, unfortunately, began, and we eventually saw that, oh man, communism and containment is still failing to be contained. So it was one of those things that, man, we're seeing communism fail to be contained. First, the Soviet countries in Europe, then China, then North Korea, then Cuba, now Vietnam. So in the 1940s, the Vietnam was controlled by the French at the time. It then became independent. And in 1951, President Truman thought it would be a good idea to try to get a democratic government created in Vietnam, although it didn't really work. Unfortunately, the United States backed a South Vietnamese Democratic Vietnam, and it didn't work out. Thousands of American men were sent to Vietnam. President JFK sent troops to Vietnam. Lyndon Baines Johnson sent people to Vietnam. It was horrible. And in fact, Americans started protesting because Americans were being drafted and sent to Vietnam against their will. And I love this video, or this image, because it shows Vietnamese citizens showing American soldiers going into Vietnam. And Vietnam was incredible because the enemies were not normal people. You didn't know who the enemies were. You didn't know the landscape in Vietnam. You didn't know who was really the enemy of the United States and enemies of capitalism. It was nuts. There was a big anti-war movement, the hippie movement, to go against communism. And really, it became very tense. These student protests against the government were a big deal. Music was even created to fight off communism in home. And even Muhammad Ali said he refused to fight in Vietnam. So communism and the Cold War was really failing in the United States and failing at a rapid rate. It just got so bad that even citizens in front of the White House chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Which LBJ was President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and these kids were those that were being drafted and sent to Vietnam and being killed, all to prevent communism from spreading in Vietnam. Again, containment, preventing communism from spreading. But it lost. Eventually, President Richard Nixon in 1968 became president, and in 1975, President Nixon said, "We're going to get rid of all American troops in Vietnam." But it came too late. We saw other countries fighting for communism, and here in the United States, in 1970 at Kent State University, kids were shot by the government who were protesting the Vietnam War. A song by Crosby, Stills, Nash Young called "Ohio" showed how bad things were going. And so when the United States realized that the Vietnam War wasn't successful, the United States couldn't prevent communism from spreading, they just flat out gave up. And so now we're seeing communism spreading to all of these countries in Europe and Asia. And where's it going to end? Will the United States come out on top, or will communism continue to spread? This is a good one to pay attention to video-wise. Hope you enjoyed it. Be good.